over time, your 100% should increase. So I think that's where people get really hung up on it. They're like, well, you're telling me to do less of each. And I'm like, well, you're doing less of each because you're doing both. But the goal over time is that you can handle more of both. Like that high volume becomes earned. And even if you could do, say, 5 hours a week of lifting before, but you were doing 0 hours of cardio at all, you're not going to be able to do 5 hours lifting and add 3 hours of cardio.
Can you paint me a picture of what your season's approach would look like for somebody who wanted to do, as you said, get better in both strength areas and in cardio? Because I think what happens for most people, they fall in one of two camps. They prioritize their cardio and their strength drops off, or vice versa. They'll work on strength and their cardio disappears. Or you'll have someone who thinks, the cardio is going to kill my gains, so I'm not going to go for a run. But then it's been a couple of weeks since I've been through a gym session, but I don't do cardio because I'm going to lose what little gains I have. And they end up doing nothing. And that's the other end of the spectrum. From your season's approach, how can someone begin to instigate that? Is it a 12-month periodization block? Paint me a picture of how you actually see it working for Gen Pop.
So you can think of it in terms of a year. You can think of it in terms of a year and a half, 2 years. The thing about hybrid training that I think a lot of people have to think about is like with just strength training or just endurance training, it makes sense. It's linear. I'm going to keep pushing this thing to get better. Where with hybrid training, you're going to have to think about like, okay, here's where I'm at now and here's where I can be in a year. And you're kind of taking like, you have these 2 steps. You have the endurance step and the strength step or muscle step or whatever it is. And you're kind of like taking the stepwise increase of each of those at the same time. And so I have this thing I like to call like the hybrid pyramid. So the base is just like your general aerobic fitness and then your general like strength capacity, your skill, your ability to move weight or move under a barbell or just lift weight, and just like the general base of like having some sort of baseline of cardiovascular fitness and having some sort of baseline of just like strength and or strength experience. And then from there, you're refining it. Okay. Then we're building volume, adding in intensity. And each of these may be becoming more technical in our lifting, more specific in our running training. And then from there, when you have this good base of like your baseline fitness, a little bit more refined, you can add a little bit more, handle more volume, handle more intensity. Then from there, we can kind of, again, take another step in that intensity, working at higher intensities, higher work outputs, higher efforts, or handle more of both at the same time. And then that's where we can kind of master that hybrid training, because what you're trying to do is raise the floor of what you're capable of doing when you're thinking of hybrid training. And the way you do that is you have to look at your base. Where are you lacking? So for many people, they're like, okay, well, it's like me when I was coming out of powerlifting and strength training, like I significantly lacked an aerobic base and aerobic fitness. So what I needed in that point in time was to take a season of time where I was extremely dedicated to building and developing my aerobic fitness and strength. And for people, depending on how much you're lacking in certain areas, that might be a process that is 12 to 24 months to do that. And so you don't want to just give up lifting the entire time that you're doing that, because that takes time. But it's going to be probably the most uncomfortable in that first like 3 to 6 months when you're developing that baseline of fitness that you need to build upon. And that's where I think most people give up, because it's more fatiguing, it's more demanding. And so your strength or your gym work will be more impacted because you're trying to manage this overall increase in volume and fatigue. And so what people need to be doing when they're adding in that one thing that they are less proficient at is pulling back the volume, or like, I really like to think of like, if you're adding in cardio to lifting, pulling back the volume and keeping the quality. So keep your intensity high, keep your weights high. People make the mistake of just lifting light for like a lot of reps. Keep it more strength focused, more quality, more strength, and or lower end of that hypertrophy type spectrum stuff. Keep your intensity and quality up. You can reduce on either end of the spectrum your volume overall in whatever area you're trying to maintain, but like 30% and still maintain or make progress. Or I think people realize that like sometimes you can make progress with less because you're able to recover more when you start adding in these things. So that's where like, if you're coming from the strength side of things, adding that in, pulling it back, lifting, keeping it more quality. I think a lot of people cling to like the 5-6 days a week of lifting coming from the bodybuilding world. And they're so hesitant to lean towards maybe like 3 full body days or a full upper, like a 4-day upper lower split, or 2 full body days, even depending on the volume or what they can handle in their week of training, and realizing that like less of quality might be helpful to pull back so you can make the space for the time and or physiological demands of building up that cardio base. But then the goal long-term would be, once you start to get more of that base and you could tolerate more and handle more of the cardio, then you kind of maintain that cardio and you bring your lifting kind of back up, or you inch it back up, because then your floor is raised and you can handle more. So then you could go into a season if you wanted to of really pushing your strength again and building up strength and muscle, but then maintaining that cardio of where you've been at. And then you can bring that up again, just depending on how far you're wanting to push your fitness. And on the contrary, for the endurance junkies, cardio bunnies, cardio lovers, a lot of them have no muscle or strength or proficiency there. And so they have the similar but opposite. They might need to spend a year or two really pulling back on the racing and the high volume running. And that doesn't mean giving up running. It just means like maybe you're not running 60 miles a week. Maybe you're running 30 miles a week or something like that. It's still like, that's just an example of that, just depending on the person. Everyone's different. Some people are runners, but they run 10 miles a week. Some are runners and they're running a bajillion miles a week. But you might need to pull back a little bit to make time and space to add in that baseline of strength and like familiarity and skill, because lifting is a skill too, right? And building that up so then you're less fatigued and less sore over time. And then, okay, you have this good strength base that you can pull from and good muscle base or whatever it is. And it's going to be easier to maintain because it's up here. And then you can bring your cardio back up and either go through a season where maybe you're pushing towards a marathon or a big racing goal or whatever that looks like. And it's all about basically titrating those steps, but balancing not just your physiological resources, because it's people they make those mistake often of like, okay, my lifting's at 100% here, but I want to start adding in cardio. So I'm going to add cardio in at 100%. And what they need to do is pull their lifting down to 80% and pull their cardio up to 20% because they only have under 100% capacity if that's what they're doing. Or like pull lifting down to 50% and put 50%. Like you have only 100% of yourself to give. But what happens all the time with hybrid training is you have this bucket of capacity, I like to call it, and you get more water in your bucket. So then you have more to give into each of these domains. And so when we think of the seasons approach, it doesn't have to be as concrete as like every quarter of the year you're doing something, but it's just about dedicating a specific period of time to certain things. So I have like what I have built this more in the phrase of like people who are race training and prepping, but that's not always true for people. But I like to think about in like a classic like sport training season, you have preseason, you have the season, you have off season, and then you have like the preseason base recovery type stuff that you're doing there. So when you're thinking about that, you're going through seasons of what I like to call strength building seasons. You're more focused on building strength and muscle in the gym. Your lifting days, your volume, your intensity goes up a little bit, and your running or cardio volume goes back a little bit. But the goal is to keep it at the volume of which you want to maintain at the least for whatever your long-term goals are. I think a lot of people make the mistake of like, hey, I like to run marathons and ultra marathons, but I'm going to drop to 5 miles a week of running. That's not what you want to do. You still want to maintain a decent base, but you want to find that happy medium of where you can maintain it, that it's still like you're still able to handle that volume and recover from it. And it's hard to give a concrete answer because for every person, that's different. I can maintain a half marathon level fitness in my off season now, where in the beginning, people might only be able to maintain like a 5K level fitness or whatever that looks like. It's really going to be, again, based on how much you personally can handle, and that should increase, or it can increase if you wanted to over time. And so I have that strength focus season where that's your main priority, that's your main goal. The percentage of your efforts and time towards strength will shift up a little bit. And then I have like the base building or pre-race prep or this is like what you would think of as your true kind of hybrid season. You're kind of balancing a good ebb and flow of both endurance training and resistance training. And I actually really like a long version of this phase. I think it's a great time where you can build a lot of aerobic fitness by just maintaining like a good base of aerobic fitness while still pushing strength and kind of making progress simultaneously, because you're never overloading one. It's kind of almost like if people like eat at maintenance in their dieting phase. Like you're not bulking or cutting rapidly, but you're kind of titrating this effort at the same time. And I think if we don't rush these phases, you can actually gain a lot of simultaneous fitness in this. And then you can move into like a race prep in peak, or in that case, that could be like an endurance like focused block of training if you're not racing, peaking and training, where, okay, the lifting is going to be pulled back. You're still keeping it in, keeping the quality where you can. Maybe you're doing less days or they're shorter, but you're kind of overloading that aerobic fitness or that endurance training that you're doing there. And then you have the recovery. So in the recovery, you're kind of taking a break from the endurance training, and I like reverse tapering back in your strength to build into that next strength phase or an extended version of the running phase if that's what you're in. And so that's how I like to think of those things, because you're kind of titrating them, but there's never, the only phase that's going to be really kind of a specific set amount of time is like if you're peaking and prepping for a race, that's usually the 6 to 12 weeks leading into it. And I think a lot of people get worried about during that period of time of like letting go of that. But if you're really overloading your training there, that's intentionally to gain a lot of fitness. You're having to get a little bit more specific on that goal of endurance training. But the goal is to maintain. You're not necessarily trying to make significant progress in your lifting. You're just trying to maintain your muscularity and in lifting capacity kind of where it's at while you're doing that. So you can make space in your physiological capacity and recovery to really dial in on that goal. But then the off season, it's kind of that antagonist of that. And so where people need to be in these really kind of depends on, again, who they're at and where they're at. The runner who's always been a runner might need a really strong, hefty strength season. And the lifter who's always been a lifter might need a really heavy, strong, hefty cardiovascular season in training. And so if it depends on how detrained you are and where you're at. But I really like this almost as like a year cycle for people who are running training. If you can fit into a year, if you have a baseline, it's the people who are really lacking in one or the other who might be like, hey, you know what? I need to suck it up and spend a year really dedicated to this one thing so that I have that second half of my base, because you can't build a pyramid on only half of the side, right? So you need to kind of figure out where you're at, what you're missing. So that's how I like to think of the seasons approach. And it's all about titrating like what you can do and where you can shift things. But then over time, your 100% should increase. So I think that's where people get really hung up on it. They're like, well, you're telling me to do less of each. And I'm like, well, you're doing less of each because you're doing both. But the goal over time is that you can handle more of both. Like that high volume becomes earned. And even if you could do, say, 5 hours a week of lifting before, but you were doing 0 hours of cardio at all, you're not going to be able to do 5 hours lifting and add 3 hours of cardio. You're probably going to have to pull down lifting to like 3 hours of lifting and put up the cardio and increase that so you can kind of adapt and handle that. And if you can get through that phase where you feel like, okay, cardio is killing my gains, my strength performance is decreasing, I'm losing everything, it's just fatigue masking performance. Same thing with running. Runners hate adding in lifting because it makes their legs sore and they run slower and they feel fatigued and they just don't give themselves enough consistency where that fatigue or that interference or that soreness goes away because you're used to the stimulus. And that's where people kind of lose their chance at really developing this. You kind of really have to commit to the bit here for an extended period of time to really be able to handle both. And I think the reason that it's so much more unsexy than just strength training or just cardio training is it is a little bit of a slower process because you're kind of building and maintaining as you go. And that's why I really like to encourage people thinking like multi-year things. So an example would be, I spent a big strength training season. I did a ton of ultras focusing on that for a really long period of time in the middle of my PhD. Did a very heavy, hard strength training season. I was also recovering from an injury and finishing my PhD. So I did lose a little bit more fitness than I would have liked at that time, but it was just kind of situational and I did what I could. And then I shifted into a really long period of time of rebuilding back my aerobic fitness. But I kind of went into a really long period of time of like, I had a good base of strength and I knew what I could handle. And I pulled that back a little bit and really it let that cardio increase. But then I just maintained. I've been doing a lot more of these long maintenance seasons in my early phases of training because I've been doing fall races where I'm spending like my January through like May or June, like in this base build phase where I'm able to still really push strength as I just maintain my running and let that kind of area under the curve of my aerobic fitness develop. I think a lot of people make the mistake of thinking running or cardio training is just increasing it linearly rather than finding a good base to maintain at and letting that repetitive stimulus and improvements in performance there drive that if it's at a high enough kind of level. And so I really like that for people who are a little bit proficient in each or refining those things, but it's all about just like figuring out like, you know, really for most people, the honest answer is what do you hate doing and what do you suck at? Go spend 6 to 12 months focused on that and then go from there.